Our discussion today is going to center on U.S. imperialism in the late 19th century. We'll deal with the early 20th century part a little bit later. But we're going to be talking about why the United States embarks on imperialism, where it goes in its imperialist sort of ventures. We will have a war the United States would fight with Spain in 1898, and what happens during that, and then sort of what happens as a result of that. So to give you an idea of an explanation of what's going on here with America beginning to become a world power, right? Imperialism, a very short sort of definition, is where you've got a much stronger power is then going to come in and dominate a weaker power economically, sort of militarily. In some cases, you have an outright political takeover. In some cases, you just have sort of domination. But why does this happen? Okay, there are a series of reasons why an imperializing power would want to do this. One is economic. Right? I know it's hard for some people to understand that people are motivated by money, but it is true. At one point in American history, people were motivated by money. I know that's not true today. Nobody does anything for money today, but it is true for this. And the economic benefits to imperialism is that the colonizing nation, as sort of the dominant partner, can utilize the raw materials that may be available only in the colony or may be available a lot less expensively in a colony, and also can use, for the most part, cheap labor, because a lot of these people they don't have industrialized economies, and so their wages are a lot lower, and you can pay them a lot less to harvest these raw materials to then return those raw materials to the industrialized home country. On the back end, once you've taken raw materials and you've manufactured some mega awesome product out of it, is the population then serves as a great sort of monopolized market to buy these industrial products. So this is a way that you can make a lot of money, is you can have access to these very necessary raw materials. There are also military reasons for this as well. One of the things that happens here in 1870 and 1871 is France and Germany are going to fight a war with each other. Long story short, Germany's going to win. All right. And a lot of people, though, realize that there's probably going to be another one of these wars, and it may get pretty big. It may get a lot bigger and a lot worse. And so ever increasingly you're seeing a lot of these European nations, but also countries like Japan and the United States are going to be looking at this going, okay, how do we get ready in case this great big war happens? And so the United States is competing with a lot of these other nations to sort of get itself into a position to where if a big war happens, and we don't know exactly how it's going to shake out, whose side are we going to be on, we need to be ready for this. Right? So there's a military reason for colonization as well. If you have far-flung colonies out away from your home space, all right, you have then access to military bases, and in the case of the United States, especially naval bases, that you can use to, one, offensively project its military power. So you can think of a good example of this as a sort of a football analogy, right? You would much rather get the ball as close to your opponent's goal line as possible. So that way you don't have very far to go to score, all right? So offensively, a military base way out in the middle of the Pacific, like say the Philippine Islands, this allows you to very quickly attack countries like China and Japan if you have to go after them. The same is true on the backside, which is on defense. You would much rather the opponent have the ball very, very far away from your goal line, because then you're going to have to go a long distance in order to score. The same is true militarily as well. You want the enemy to start someplace else. You want to make them overrun your outposts someplace else, rather than just immediately having to start at your coastline, because they're very, very close to sort of bombing your home territory or something like that. And so this is the ability the United States wants to follow to strengthen itself against possible enemies. And as we're going to see, eventually these enemies are going to be in World War I. There's also a nationalist idea. The idea of domination of lesser peoples is going to make the imperial power look strong, and if people sort of feel strong. You'll see this especially strong in European colonization and Japanese colonization. You'll see this somewhat amongst Americans. They'll refer to this, for example, as sort of missionary activity that's the white man's burden to bring Christianity and education and civilization to the rest of the world. But there's also, as I mentioned, a strong sort of nationalist component for the United States, that we don't want all these other nations that may go to war with us to take up all these imperialized spots, to take up all these colonies around the world as well. So it's very much a competitive kind of thing with other nations as well. This is a Hawaiian sugar plantation operated by Americans in Hawaii. So this is, of course, before Hawaii became part of the United States as well. So there's monetary reasons to get involved. This is the Great White Fleet that would eventually be sent around the world by President Theodore Roosevelt. And you need these bases around the world so that way you can project your military might. You got one of these great big battleships, it shows up, it's like, look at America. Don't mess with us, right? And so the ability to project military strength outward and then also to play defense if you have to at a place that's further out, these are important military considerations as well. One of the great people that give voice to that is Alfred Thayer Mann, The Importance of Sea Power in History. And this was a book that he put together. He was a professor at the Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland. And this was the basic argument that he makes here is that all the great civilizations throughout the history of the world, whether it's the Greeks, whether it's the Romans, whether it's the British, right, all of them had been built upon the idea that they had dominance of the waves. They had the ability to control the oceans, and then that gives them a great deal of advantages. One, militarily, you can attack anybody wherever you want because you can move very quickly by water. You can land troops on somebody's shoreline and attack them very, very quickly. But also economically, it gives you access to all these places because your military, your naval military, can protect your civilian trading empires. And of course, then economically, they make more money so that you can build larger navies. So it's a sort of a hand-in-glove relationship. And Mann's thesis, his book, really started reaching a lot of high levels of government, including eventually guys like Theodore Roosevelt with this as well. And so this is some of the criticism that you'll see. White man's burden, you've got sort of dark-skinned colonial type of person, these native, and then you've got the American sort of dressed in his khakis, and he's picking these guys up, these poor guys living in mud huts, and they're going to carry him to the schoolhouse. And of course, our native guy, he doesn't look terribly enthused about this type of activity. But this is the idea that you saw a lot of people put forward, that it's the white man's burden. We've got to go and help these lesser people around the world. While that sounds sort of condescending, that's because it kind of is, but some people did have a very positive view of this, that we're helping to bring civilization, missionary type of people, we're helping to bring Christianity to these people, and so they felt pretty good about it. Not everybody will, though, feel good about this, as we'll see when we get into the debates on this. So when you look at the American world by the 1880s, the closing of the frontier has a very profound impact on the American psyche. This is something that had existed for almost 300 years of the American experience. That there's a frontier, there's a land space in North America for us to conquer and tame and to build cities and to cut down the trees and to have farms and wild animals to kind of fend off. And if you have these large sort of families, they've got a place to go, they can have new land, and then all of a sudden it's gone. That's not there anymore. So what do we do? Where does this frontier spirit go next? And you'll even see this kind of hang around in the 1960s. John F. Kennedy would talk about it. We need new frontiers. Space. We'll shoot rockets into space. And so a lot of these Americans here in the 1880s and 1890s, they wonder where are we going to go now? We got to conquer new places because that's what Americans do. We conquer space, right? So imperialism seems like a way to expand the American markets, to grow the U.S. economy, and to provide outlets for U.S. suppliers. Because as I mentioned in the talk about industrialization, American economies of scale are mushrooming. They're growing faster than even the American market can safely absorb. So we got to find places to bring in enough raw materials to make more stuff, and then places to sell all this stuff to. All right. One of the other things you'll notice about all the targets of U.S. expansionism during this period, every last one of them are maritime provinces, which means they all have access to the ocean. You're not going to see the United States, very interested in going after some of these landlocked countries in the middle of Africa. The United States doesn't care about that. They only want places that they can use to flex its military through its growing navy. And of course, this makes a lot of sense for a country that is bordered by two oceans. You've got Europe and Africa, to the east, and then you've got Asia to the west, across the Pacific. And so they're very worried about securing their frontiers. In this case, the United States' frontiers are a couple of oceans. So any bases the United States can get and have access to via its navy, this is going to be preeminent. A good example is a case study to understand kind of how this works is Hawaii. Hawaii was actually known as the Sandwich Islands at this point. And I think they changed it so that way you wouldn't be hungry every time that you talk about it. Also, too, the natives refer to it as Hawaii, so that made it easier. And this is going to be the first sort of major target and a test case for U.S. imperialism. Now, there are those major U.S. naval base that was there that have been worked out by a treaty between the United States government and the Hawaiians. hey, can we have a base here at Pearl Harbor? Yes, it's a really good sort of base, a naval base that we're going to build there. And so the Hawaiians said, yes, okay, you guys can have it. This was not something the United States sort of seized. But ever increasingly, there was a growing number of Americans that were living in Hawaii that were working on a number of sugar plantations, pineapple plantations, and things like that. So they were American business people. They were employing local Hawaiians as laborers. And eventually they realized that it would be a lot easier, instead of us having to deal with the local Hawaiian government and then deal with the United States government, is we just sort of cut out the middleman. And if Hawaii was part of the United States, then we could just deal business directly without tariffs and fees and treaties and trade, blah, blah, blah. So anyway, well, how do you do that? You know, you go to the Hawaiian government, hey, why don't you just let the United States of America take you over? Answer's probably going to be no, right? So what the Americans living in Hawaii did was they staged a coup. They took over the government, they forced out the king, and they took over power for themselves, right? And they did this so they could expand their sugar and their fruit operations that were there. So once they had installed an American president, right, in Hawaii, his name was Sanford Dole. Yep. Next time you go buy Dole fruit at the supermarket, that's him, right? Once he is now the leader of the government, he then turns around and he asks the United States government to annex the Hawaiian Islands as a territory. Now look, nobody in the United States Senate that has to ratify this treaty is an idiot about what's going on here. The Hawaiians want us to take over. This is a great moment for democracy. They know that this was a coup staged by Sanford Dole and some of those other people in order to reduce the trade barriers, to kick out a legitimate Hawaiian government. But at the same point, adding Hawaii to the United States, this would solve a lot of problems for the United States. This could be pretty helpful. The debate in the Senate is very heated. Is imperialism right? Is imperialism wrong? What are we going to do with an imperial sort of activity in the Pacific Ocean? Some say yes, some say no. It gets pretty sort of nasty with this, but eventually they decide they are going to ratify the treaty. They are going to add Hawaii as a territory to the United States. And so this is an important sort of step on. This is Queen Liliuokalani, Queen Lil, as she was known in the United States. She's part of the ruling monarchy of Hawaii that eventually is forced out by this guy, right? Who is so bad to the bone that one beard wouldn't cover it, so he actually has two, right? There's Sanford Dole, who is the president of Hawaii after this coup, right? Major source, though, of activity for the United States in terms of imperialism is going to come in Cuba, right? Now, one thing that you've got to understand about Cuba is the last sort of vestige of that great Spanish overseas empire, which was like a continent and a half at one point in the 1500s. They had Mexico, they had all of South America except for Brazil, they've got basically all of the Caribbean, and over the course of the 1800s, that empire just kept shrinking, that more and more countries just kept declaring their independence and breaking away from the Spanish Empire until eventually, by the late 1800s, the only thing that the Spanish have left is Cuba. Well, the Cubans want independence as well, and finally in 1895 the Cubans have had enough, and they start resisting through armed violence Spanish control. Now, they've got to resort to guerrilla-style warfare, kind of hiding out in the jungles and the hills and attacking the Spanish military in sort of small bands. These guys, the insurrectos, right? And the goal is to just make living in Spain just so hot for the Spanish that eventually the Spanish will pull out and say, okay, Cuba, it's too expensive, it's too much of a drain on our resources to keep you, and so Cuba, you guys can have your independence. So that's the goal of the insurrectos, is to fight this sort of guerrilla-style war against the Spanish starting in 1895. Well, the Spanish, they don't want to let Cuba go. Cuba's the last thing that they've got. And so what they're going to do is they're going to respond. They're going to round up a lot of these Cubans, and they're going to put them into barbed wire concentration camps. This is going to prevent them from aiding the Cuban insurrectos because they can't give them food and ammunition, and you can't send messages in and out. Now, when you hear the term concentration camp, we immediately sort of think of Nazis in World War II. These guys are being led to the gas chambers. It's not that. This is not a death camp. They're not exterminating them. But it is a concentration camp, and they're not exactly treated the best. So, they're put into jail, basically, with this. And, of course, they are fighting back against the insurrectos, right? Well, Americans were outraged by this, all right? They view these guys are being mistreated. This seems like, liberty is being squashed by a tyrant king in Europe. That sounds pretty much like the American Revolution. What you're also going to see is there are a lot of these newspapers are going to be exaggerating these stories in this situation in order to sell newspapers. They're pushing Americans towards war because they realize that war sells more newspapers than peace does. And so these guys would be called yellow journalists because they're not necessarily going to lie, although in some cases they will just out and out lie, but they're definitely going to exaggerate what is going on with this as well. American businesses also invested very heavily in Cuban operations, sugar plantations, tobacco plantations, that kind of thing. And so you're going to see that initially the business people are, well, I don't know, we don't want a war, that may disrupt things, and then when it looks like war is inevitable, well, we definitely want to try to have a war so we can take over. And so the business leaders are very heavily involved in what is going on in Cuba as well, and a lot of these military leaders are pointing out the fact that, hey, we have one half of the Florida Strait with Florida, with the Keys, with our military bases there. If we can take over military bases in Cuba, then we're basically going to have a lock control onto entrance and egress from the Caribbean Sea. This would be a major military outpost for us to have as well. And so there are certain reasons for the United States to get involved with Cuba beyond just, oh, we feel bad for the Cuban people. Although for the most part, on the street level, this is kind of why a lot of Americans are going to be interested in this. So here you can see these Cuban insurrectos, and they've been rounded up, and a lot of these guys have been put behind barbed wire. This is an American sugar plantation operating out of Cuba at this point as well. So, as I mentioned, a lot of these yellow journalists, they're pushing for war. They're taking the truth, they're stretching it. In some cases, they're stretching it to the point that it kind of breaks off. And they definitely are going to exaggerate. In some cases, they make some pretty wild exaggerations. They realize that war would sell a lot more newspapers than peacetime would. All right? They're going to accuse the Spanish of every single possible crime that they can think of. One of the great quotes from the newspaperman of the day, Hearst, his guy had gone down there, his artist had gone down there, Remington, and he says, well, I'm drawing these pictures here, you put in the paper of what's going on. It really doesn't look that bad. It's not that bad down here in Cuba. And Hearst's reply was, you supply the pictures, I'll supply the war. Because while you're drawing the pictures, I'm the one that makes up the headlines that goes with them. And so, as we can see, media can inflame people. You also see running in a lot of these newspapers editorials and stories talking about how manly war is. How people, the heroes and veterans of the Civil War were writing in, and providing these stories of adventure in the 1860s. And it's been 30 years since there was a real war. And, man has to, express himself militarily, that martial spirit. So you see a lot, basically it's a sort of a full court press to try to push Americans socially and politically. We need to declare war on these Spanish. We need to help the poor Cubans. They're just being oppressed by the Spanish. They're just like George Washington and those guys against the British. So this is what you're going to see in the newspapers of the day, okay? One of the ways they're going to do this is they're going to go into the diplomatic bag, which is not how you're supposed to do this. It's supposed to be a private letter, a diplomatic letter from the Spanish ambassador, de Lome, and he's writing back to talk about the new American president, McKinley, right, who is subject of debate. The Spanish government realizes there's a lot of tension between their government and the United States. So what's the new president? What's he like? Okay, de Lome is doing his job as an ambassador. He's informing his home government what the new American president is like. He met with him, and he basically, in the letter, he describes McKinley. He calls him weak. He says he's just a bidder for public opinion. He's not a strong leader, blah, blah, blah. He insults McKinley in this letter. Well, when the yellow journalists print this in the newspaper, it inflames the American populace, okay? And, whoever is president, at whatever various times throughout your life, you're going to either like them or you're going to hate them. And, even if it's a president that you don't particularly care for and you may criticize these people, such an idiot and all this kind of stuff. It's one thing for us to criticize our president. It's another thing for a foreigner to do it. We don't particularly care for that. Wait a second now. Yeah, you may not like him, but he's my president, right? These people, they're my leader. So this is what's going to take place here in America as well. A lot of Americans are very incensed by this kind of thing. So you've got a lot of tension taking place politically, economically, militarily, and now socially between the U.S. populace and Spain. And so tensions are running high. You've got ever-increasing amount of violence between the insurrectos and the Spanish in Cuba. And so the United States is going to dispatch a gunship, a battleship, the USS Maine, to the Cuban waters to, one, ostensibly in case there is, fighting between the Cubans and the Spanish, this will give the Americans in Havana, a place to go. They can hide on the USS Maine in case there's all kinds of crazy violence and the city's burned down, that kind of thing. But also we know what this is, which is this is a flex move by the United States. It's like, here's our battleship. Don't mess with us. Right? And so that's what's going on here as well. This is a graphic done by Frederick Remington, and it shows a Cuban woman who is trying to board this steamer to go to America. All right? And Spanish agents are searching her because they suspect that she is in league with the insurrectos. And so they strip search her, and you can see how this is. She's nude, and she's got to put up with these sort of pawing, and they got one guy in the back who's smirking. I get to see her naked. And, they're checking her all out. This is going to inflame manly passion that a woman should be treated so badly by these perverted Spanish agents. This makes me want to go to war. These jerks, these rat turds. Right? And so that was the effect that it was supposed to have. And that was the effect that it did have. And for the most part, it was fake. There really was a Cuban woman, and she really did get searched. She did not get strict search. She got searched by a female member of the immigration staff there by the Spanish government. And so, but that's not really nearly as exciting as a woman who's stripped and robbed of her dignity by these ogling Spanish agents. And so you can see the effect that this is going to have on the American populace and how sort of yellow journalism works. This is the Delome letter. This is what it looked like. When it is published, it sort of drives these guys into sort of fits of fury with this as well. So, as I mentioned, sending the Maine to Havana Harbor was a show of strength, right? It was there ostensibly to provide refuge for Americans if they needed a place to retreat in case there was open warfare between the Cubans and the Spanish. But what happens here is on February 15th of 1898, the USS Maine explodes. Kablamo! Okay? And 260 officers and men are going to perish in the explosion. All right? The Yellow Press didn't need an investigation to determine what had happened. All right? The Spanish realized that, the United States, you guys are trying to get involved. You're on the side of the Cubans, and so we're going to try to keep you out. And so the Spanish must have planted a bomb on the USS Maine, and it blew up. And they ran, these headlines, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain. Spanish agents explode USS Maine, blah, blah, blah." Right? Now, when you're going to think about that for just a second, you're Spain, you're having trouble keeping a hold of Cuba. Your government, your creaky old medieval government is falling apart around your ears, and you're going to blow up a U.S. battleship, provoke war with the largest industrial power on the planet, and you're having trouble just with the armed guerrillas in the foothills. This is really about the dumbest thing that you could do. Okay. Later investigations realized that the most likely scenario is that something on board the Maine exploded, the boiler or maybe the coal bunker or something like that, which happened on these steam-powered vessels, really more than we would be comfortable admitting. Sometimes these things just explode, they just blow up. Okay. And so, but the Yellow Press blamed the Spanish, and you got catchy slogans like "Remember the Maine and to hell with Spain," right? And so the American public is going to follow suit as a result of that. So you've got all this pressure from all these different quarters on President McKinley, socially, politically, economically, even militarily. And so finally, McKinley is going to ask Congress to declare war on Spain, ostensibly to liberate the oppressed Cubans. So now we've got an actual war for this. And so this is an artist's rendition of the USS Maine exploding in Havana Harbor. For those of you who have never seen a steamship in the 1890s explode, this gives you a pretty good idea of what it might look like. These buttons went around, right? "Remember the Maine," with the Maine's logo printed on it. All right? So the first battle of the war, and we're going to see all this tension around Cuba is going to be taking place, and the Maine explodes in Cuba's waters. So the first battle of the war is going to take place here in the Philippine Islands, off the coast of China. I thought Cuba was like in the Caribbean, South America, not across the Pacific. How does this make sense? Okay. when you understand exactly what's going on here, we have to start understanding a little bit about the personalities. All right, the U.S. Secretary of the Navy had gone away for the weekend. All right, he was, I think he was like hunting in Vermont with his family or something like that. And so, as all this is taking place, his assistant, the Assistant Secretary of Navy, Secretary of the Navy, is a guy named Theodore Roosevelt. More on him later. Actually, a lot more on this guy later. And he is going to take over, and he's going to, okay, we need to be ready in case of war. What are we going to do with this, right? And Roosevelt takes it upon himself, and he sends orders to the U.S. Pacific Fleet that is refueling in Hong Kong. It's under the command of Admiral Dewey, and he says, listen, in the event of war, what you're going to do is you're immediately going to sail to the Spanish colony of the Philippines, and you're going to knock out the Spanish Navy, and you're going to set up, and you're going to take over. So, okay, those are the orders, and they go through here. Dewey, he's refueling his fleet. He gets these orders that are sent to him, and all right, he receives word that the United States has declared war on Spain. All righty, and he steams directly for the Philippine Islands. This is a Spanish colony, and he's going to do this. And what you're going to see is really a tale of two navies. He has a very modern, steam-powered, metal, all steel, sort of armored battle fleet with basically the best technical equipment available to navies here in the 1890s, versus an old wooden fleet that the Spanish had. And exactly what you would think of metal battleships versus wood battleships is pretty much what's going to take place. It is a completely one-sided affair. Dewey's fleet absolutely smashed the Spanish Navy. In fact, they only had one casualty on the U.S. side. It was a guy who died of heat prostration. I don't know if he just got so excited because of the one-sided victory that he died, but anyway. Dewey takes over. He's got command now of all the waterways around the Philippine Islands. All he has to do is wait for the army to come in, move inland, and take over. And it's going to be a very easy kind of thing. And so Alfred Thayer Mann's thesis is proved absolutely correct, that you dominate the sea lanes, and especially around an island archipelago, taking over is pretty easy. And so this is an artist's rendition of what it would look like. If you're having trouble picking out which one's which, the side that's firing is the Americans. The side that's on fire is the Spanish fleet. And so you can see the Spanish fleet, they're either underwater or on fire. And that's probably pretty accurate given what we know about the battle. Here you can see early reports of the battle here between Dewey's fleet and the Spanish fleet off the coast of Manila in the Philippines. So, okay, on to Cuba finally. Right? We're finally going to see some fighting in the place that we would expect it to be, which is in Cuba. Well, what happens is there's such a war fever for Americans. It had been 30 years since the Civil War. There have really been no major American wars since then, and you're going to see that Americans are going to hastily mobilize for the war. They want to get in on this fighting as quickly as possible. You'll see a lot of people that write about this, that they didn't want to miss the war. They didn't want to be so late to the fighting that the war would be over before I got into it. Okay? Roosevelt's going to resign from his position from the Department of the Navy, probably before he gets fired for what he did. And he's got a new plan. He wants to go off and he wants to fight. He wants to prove his manliness. And he is going to help form a regiment of volunteer cavalry. All right? And he's going to draw sort of a cross-section of American society. You're going to have these Westerners, these Pathfinders, Indian fighters, cowboys. Also, you're going to mix in these guys, the Eastern dandies, these guys that have gone to these sort of wealthy Eastern colleges. He's also going to have some urban workers, city toughs, even a few guys that have spent some time in jail. And they are going to be all put together in the same regiment, and he's going to nickname these guys the Rough Riders. This is before they went into rap music. Okay? Roosevelt realizes that he doesn't have any military experience, so he finds a guy who'd been a commander of cavalry forces in the West, a guy John J. Pershing. So Pershing is going to be the commander initially of the regiment. Roosevelt's going to be the second command. He'll be the lieutenant colonel. And you're going to see all these forces are going to be heading to Tampa. Tampa, Florida is going to be the headquarters for the entire war operation as it takes place in Cuba. The United States government needed a large port facility. Check. Tampa has that. That's connected by rail line to the rest of the nation. Check. In 1885, Tampa is connected with the plant rail line to the rest of the country, a place where the United States government could get camp facilities in relatively large quantities for a relatively limited amount of money. Check. So Tampa is the place where these people are going to be, and this is going to be the point of embarkation. They're going to have these little camps down in Tampa as they're waiting for the army to form, and they are then going to embark on these ships to go down to Cuba and fight. Well, chaos is going to erupt here in Tampa because the military command says, all right, there are not enough ships to take everybody down to Cuba in one lift, in one way. So we're going to take one group down to Cuba, we're going to drop them off, and then we're going to come back, grab another group of soldiers and take them down. Well, nobody wanted to be in the second lift. And units are going to fight each other to try to get onto the transports. For example, the Rough Riders are going to fight this other, they're going to steal a train to take them from their camps to the port facilities, and then they're going to take over a ship that was originally designated for an infantry unit, so it has almost no space for horses. They're going to take that over sort of like pirates, and they're going to sail it out of the harbor, and they're going to be going off in this manner. And because it's so sort of insane, the Rough Riders are basically going to fight the entire campaign, despite the fact they're a cavalry unit on foot, because they had to leave their horses behind in Hillsborough County. Finally, the troops are going to land on the shores of Cuba near Santiago. The reason for this is Santiago is where the Spanish Navy has holed up behind the forts, and if you can go and you knock out the Spanish Navy, then you can go in and you can take over basically all of Cuba with this as well. So the plan is to attack Santiago's forts, but first you got to move out of the jungle around Daiquiri to be able to do this. And so this is a really sort of chaotic kind of thing. This is a New York unit that's put together. They're going to go off and they're going to fight. None of these guys want to miss the war. They hurry up. You got to get there right away. This is the Rough Rider Regiment. There is Colonel Wood. This is Lieutenant Colonel Roosevelt. And so Leonard Wood's going to be the commander. Roosevelt is going to be the lieutenant colonel. They're going to be serving alongside a couple of other cavalry units commanded by John J. Pershing. And so this is the Rough Rider unit. This is them while they're training out in Texas. And you'll notice they're all mounted. That's because they're a cavalry unit. They'll fight on foot the entire campaign in Cuba because of all the chaos that ensues with this as well. You can see that Roosevelt has decided that he needs a different type of uniform. He comes with a khaki uniform so he'll look cool. Roosevelt comes from money, so he can buy his own uniform. He gets one for Leonard Wood to wear as the colonel as well. And so why not? It's a screwy war. We can have our own uniforms. Okay. This is the Rough Riders. They've taken over the ship in Tampa Harbor, and they're going to be sailing it out with this as well. So it is a pretty screwy war all around. You've got guys like General Shafter, who was the overall commander of U.S. forces. He was so obese that he couldn't hardly ride a horse. It took 4 men to sort of hoist him around on a door so that he could see the battlefield. So he's ridiculously fat. The commander of all the cavalry forces was an ex-Confederate general who was in his 60s, I think, at this point. Joseph Wheeler, who spends a lot of the fighting in the war, sick with yellow fever, and apparently he's mildly delusional as to which war he's fighting because he's shouting to his men, "The Yankees are on the run! The Yankees are on the run!" Members of the staff, having to explain to the subordinate commanders, who's he talking about? What Yankees are he talking about? He means the Spaniards, okay? He just press the attack. And so this is what's going on, okay? A laughable sort of command structure. Some of these people are political appointees. It's nuts, all right? They are going to engage the Spanish in the jungles. They're going to eventually fight these guys out of them, and they're going to start driving them backwards towards Santiago. They did have to hurry, though, because tropical diseases like malaria and yellow fever were incapacitating the Americans much, much worse than any of the battle casualties that were taking them over while they're fighting the actual Spanish. The Spanish army is eventually going to stop on the hills outside of Santiago. This is the San Juan Hill Chain. So there's sort of a large ridge line, and if you capture these, then you've got the elevated position overlooking Santiago and its harbor and its forts. And so this is a position the Spanish actually have to stop and fight, defend, because if you give up any more ground here, then basically you've given up Santiago, and as we're going to see, you're going to have basically given up the entire war. Well, the Rough Riders and African-American troops that were nicknamed the Buffalo Soldiers, a couple of regiments of those under the command of John Pershing, they're going to charge up Kettle Hill while the rest of the army is going to charge up San Juan Hill and taking the remaining heights. They got to go uphill against guys with rifles and machine guns, and it's pretty rough, but they are going to capture it. They're going to go up the hill, and they're going to eventually seize the heights. And so the defenses are lost. The Spanish fleet is going to try to break out and escape. They're pursued and eventually smashed and captured by the American fleet. Long story short, after only a few months, the fighting in Cuba is going to be over. So this is a group of reenactors to give you an idea of kind of what American soldiers will look like fighting in the jungles of Cuba. So this gives you a good idea. They're armed with their Krag Jorgensen bolt-action rifles. And this is an artist rendition of what the charge up San Juan Hill may have looked like. There you can see Roosevelt leading the charge, and of course all these guys are forced to fight on foot as they charge up the hill. This is a couple of regiments of African-American soldiers that are also going up during the charge up on Kettle Hill. You can see the Spanish entrenched behind these positions on the crest as well. All right, so the United States wins. Hooray! Yay! Right? Like it or not, the United States is a major colonial power by defeating Spain, because the peace settlement is going to hand Cuba and Puerto Rico and the Philippines over to the United States as protectorships, meaning the United States has them and they're going to protect them. I thought the Cubans wanted independence. Right? Well, again, you're going to have another hot debate in Congress. Is this moral? Is this immoral? Should we be an imperial power? Should we be overlord? Is this really American? Do we want to take these other places over? Well, of course we do, because we want to protect them from these other European powers that are going to try to take them over to get their positions for what eventually is going to be known as World War I. Right? So this debate in Congress is moral, and you'll see a debate in a few quarters. But for the most part, the American people, this was an easy kind of thing. Is the war right? Is the war wrong? Is colonialism right? Is it wrong? Oh, it's right. There's just nothing to it, right? Because this was a splendid little war, as some Americans refer to it. It was relatively short. It was relatively inexpensive. Not a lot of Americans died in the fighting. And, of course, you get all this stuff by beating the stuffing out of Spain, right? So this experience in the Spanish-American War, that colonialism is relatively cheap and it's fun and it makes you feel good to beat the crap out of somebody else, is going to prod the United States into further imperial actions as we get into the first decades of the 20th century. And so this is going to be our end of our discussion here of late 19th century.